The U.S. has assessed that Russia likely launched a counter-space weapon last week that is close to and capable of attacking a U.S. government satellite orbiting nearby. Well, what is a space weapon? Let's talk about it on Azimuth Podcast. I'm Kimberly McNabb, and with me as always is Barrett McNabb.
Yeah, thanks, Kimberly. So these are weapons that can attack space systems in orbit. For example, anti-satellite weapons attack targets on Earth from space or disable missiles traveling through space. So it ranges a wide gambit.
Well, why care about satellites, other than for satellites for our cell phones?
Yeah, so, as we all know, satellites have a variety of uses, including communications, weather forecasting, navigation, all the GPS satellites, broadcasting, scientific research, and Earth observation. Additional military uses are reconnaissance, early warning, and signals intelligence, and potentially weapon delivery. So U.S. offensive systems are totally reliant on satellites. As we see, the HIMARS rockets, which are GPS-guided in Ukraine, that the U.S. gave Ukraine, is now starting to slowly become less effective as Russia starts to rely on GPS jamming. So that's, some ground-based defenses that Russia has. But our defenses are also dependent on satellites as, they give us missile launch warnings and missile tracking. NORAD uses those to make sure that North America is safe from incoming ballistic missile threats. The launch comes at a time as the U.S. and its allies are increasingly concerned about Russia's efforts to develop nuclear space weapon capable of destroying commercial and government satellites. And it's kind of interesting because back in February, a Republican senator had received a classified intelligence. Was it House or Senate?
It was House. Mike Turner from Ohio.
Right. So he received a classified intelligence brief and said, look, I can't tell you what the brief is about, but I highly recommend the Biden administration declassify it so that the American public can know about it. And eventually, through channels, it was talking about this nuclear space-based weapon. And interestingly, the news media kind of made fun of it. And for me, I'm like, that's not something to laugh at. I'm surprised it hasn't happened already. I mean, honestly,
Russia.
It's Russia. I'm surprised that there's not already 12, up there. But U.S. officials said in remarks before a vote on the UN Security Council resolution drafted by Russia on outer space security that on May 16th, Russia launched a satellite into Earth orbit that the United States had assessed as likely that counter space weapon that we talked about. And it's presumably capable of attacking other satellites in low Earth orbit. Now, Russia deployed this new counter space weapon in the same orbit as a U.S. government satellite. So is that a coincidence? I don't think so.
No. Well, it undermines Russia's claims that it is seeking outer space security.
Yeah, that seems to me to be just BS. That's just a smokescreen. Obviously, there's lots of political speak that goes into this, but a U.S. official separately told CNN that the U.S. had been expecting the launch for at least the last several weeks, and North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, and U.S. Northern Command tracked it as it happened. So the Russia issued these NOTAMs, which are notices to airmen. And those are anytime you're going to be utilizing in airspace or informing other countries that there's going to be some type of activity. Obviously, you don't want to be flying an airliner over Kazakhstan as Roscosmos launches a missile into space and hit a 747. So they put these no-fly areas. But it became active on May 16th, indicating a possible space launch. One was for the launch itself, right, for the satellite, and the other was for a reentry of some space junk that was supposed to hit off the coast of Baja California. And so, the good news, there is some good news. So the good news is that the NOTAM responsible is a normal way for nations to support safe air and maritime activities. And so it is good that Russia at least told us that they were going to be launching something.
Yeah, they could have said nothing.
They could have said nothing, and then we would have just, obviously seen that missile go up. Everybody starts to panic, the pucker factor starts to set in when you just have this ICBM launching up, because then you want to see if it's followed by anything else. So our systems go to a higher state of readiness, but by letting us know that they were launching something, we were at least able to track that. Now, again, they didn't say what they launched, but the intelligence says that it's this space weapon. So the U.S. and its allies have been working to deter Russia from developing this nuclear space weapon. If it's deployed, the weapon it's going to be a nuclear explosion in space, right? And so you're going to have destruction of intelligence satellites. You're going to have communication satellites that are going to go down. Telescopes that the European Space Union has put into space. The Hubble Space Telescope, all that kind of stuff would be affected. But it would also create this massive energy wave called an EMP, or electromagnetic pulse, and it's going to cripple electronic devices depending upon where it's exploded in our atmosphere and how close it was to the U.S. But again, commercial, government, all would be affected.
Be like Leave the World Behind, that movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, in April, the U.S. and Japan jointly introduced a UN Security Council resolution that called for UN member states not to develop space-based nuclear weapons. But Russia vetoed it.
Surprise. Something
the U.S. saw as a sign that it is indeed pursuing a nuclear space-based weapon.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not wanting to do it, and someone says, well, okay, hey, let's go ahead and put this in writing, and you veto it, then odds are
a little suspicious.
Yeah, odds are you're developing this space-based weapon, and again, I'm surprised that it hasn't happened already.
Right.
I think there's a movie, Space Cowboys. So there's a movie.
With Tommy Lee Jones?
Tommy Lee Jones,
yes.
Clint Eastwood. And the premise of the movie is that Skylab, which was a space station, U.S. space station that was a precursor to the International Space Station, had some kind of navigation, special navigation system, whatever. And the Russians have a satellite that is coming out of orbit, and they need assistance. And the whole thing is well, how did a Russian satellite get Skylab's navigation system? So without going further, too much further in the movie, bottom line, they launch these old guys into space. They go to the satellite, and inside the satellite is like 12 nuclear weapons that are already in space, aimed down to be a first strike capability. So, I mean, come on. They did it in Hollywood. So why wouldn't Russia be doing that in real life? And it turns out they are.
Well, art's loosely based on reality, or vice versa, whichever way you want to argue it. So National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said in a statement on April 24th, as we have noted previously, the United States assesses that Russia is developing a new satellite carrying a nuclear device. We have heard President Putin say publicly that Russia has no intention of deploying nuclear weapons in space. Well, if that were the case, Russia would not have vetoed this resolution.
Yeah, I mean, it's just common sense. Hey, let's all sign an agreement that we're not going to commit crime. Okay, that'll work, right? But the Russian weapon is still under development as far as the nuclear weapon, and not yet in orbit, according to our intelligence sources. But the Biden administration officials have emphasized that it's on the horizon, right? It's on the horizon. But if used, it would cross a dangerous Rubicon in the history of nuclear weapons. I mean, that would be obviously a first. Now, Russia introduced its own rival resolution earlier this month, calling for the prohibition for all time on the placement of weapons in space. So no weapons in space at all.
Not just not nuclear.
Exactly. Okay. But the U.S. vetoed it on Monday because it does not achieve the simple task that we set out to achieve several months ago, and to reaffirm the basic obligations of the Outer Space Treaty and avoid a nuclear arms race in outer space. But, U.S. officials and the U.S. ambassador took particular issue with the resolution's call for a binding mechanism to ban any space-based weapons, saying such a ban cannot be verified, right? Because, the famous Reagan quote, "Trust but verify." and that the resolution was an attempt by Russia to distract global attention from its development of a new satellite carrying a nuclear device. I mean, give me a break. But this really isn't new. I mean, one of my favorite books as a middle schooler and high schooler was by Tom Clancy, the techno thriller. He's the one that invented the techno thriller novel, and it's Red Storm Rising, and it was 1986 that it came out, and it's ultimately a World War III conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States and NATO as well. But one of the opening salvos that Russia did, or the Soviet Union did, in the book was they had a satellite that was in orbit, and a bunch of naval reconnaissance, so satellites that were looking for naval ships and things like that, noticed that a Soviet satellite had kind of changed its trajectory, and they said, well, we'll just keep an eye on it. And right before Russia or the Soviet Union launched their attacks, they're like, hey, we can't find the satellite anymore, this Soviet satellite, and they are spinning it, and the cameras pick up the satellite right next to the naval satellite, and it detonates. And so that's back in 1986 that Tom Clancy, talked about satellite warfare. But the Strategic Defense Initiative, which I really thought was always pretty cool because it was nicknamed the Star Wars program. George Lucas actually sued because he said, having this
like he didn't have enough money.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he just said that having these weapons being associated with Star Wars hurt his brand, and so anyway, the lawsuit was tossed out. So they said, look, there's no reasonable assumption that your movie and Hollywood is going to be misassociated with American defense. So anyway, that was thrown out, but still, it was nicknamed Star Wars, and Ronald Reagan talked about it in a speech in '83, and he said, look, I want to put our technological and intellectual horsepower into taking a look at this and seeing what we could do, because this the mutually assured destruction, the MAD, which was kind of the status quo with the United States having thousands of nuclear weapons and the Soviet Union having thousands of nuclear weapons. Nobody would do a first launch, because then you would counter launch, and both countries and arguably most of the world would just be completely wiped out, and so therefore nobody would ever be the first to pull the trigger. But
right, because no one would win.
Nobody would win. Nobody would win, and except people living in Argentina, I guess, by the South Pole.
People in Kansas with 1950s era nuclear bunkers.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. But anyway, the Soviet Union kind of was like, well, if you're going to start destroying our missiles in space with these weapons, then we need to be looking at that as well. And so the Soviets in 1987 tried to test the components of a carbon dioxide laser, and it was called the SKIF, SKIF laser. And they had a competing space station, the Mir. And again, this is prior to the International Space Station as well. But they had this carbon dioxide laser and the components disguised as a Mir space station module. And they launched it into outer space to be able to test these components of this carbon dioxide laser. And fortunately for us, the guidance system failed. And so when it separated from the booster, it failed to reach orbit. And so we didn't have anything, that was able to do that. But interestingly enough on that as well, the same Zara module that had failed, that's actually keeps the International Space Station in its orbit as well. So they luckily it worked that time. Mm-hmm. But this just goes again to this height of this aggression by Russia. And and to be fair, China's doing the same aggression as well. But Russia, invading Ukraine, you've got the maritime and the maritime boundaries between Russia and I believe it's Estonia. Russia has gone and pulled up a bunch of buoys that mark the boundary on the river, and just is saying we're just going to move these. And then just recently, the Ministry of Defense had a resolution that they're going to redraw the maritime boundaries between Norway and Russia as well, just arbitrarily. They're just like, hey, we're just going to move the boundary because, yeah, we signed something, 20 years ago that locked in the boundaries, but we feel the maps weren't as accurate then as.
Of course they don't.
Yeah, and so they're just going to steal territory, and this is kind of where Nikki Haley, a lot of her campaign speeches was when Putin says that the Baltics are going to come back under his sphere of influence, that also the Latvia, Estonia, they're going to come back under, Poland's going to come back under his sphere of influence. If somebody says it, you got to believe them, right? And so here we have, just, hey, we're arbitrarily redrawing our borders. And that's effectively what some of Russia's argument is, that why they're just grabbing Ukraine is that Ukraine should never have been a country anyway. It was part of the United States, and the Nazis are back, and we're just going to grab some of this territory.
Wow. Well, that's a lot.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I keep apprised. Obviously, I retired from the Army 9 years ago, but I still keep apprised of all this stuff. And it's very interesting to me. I looking at geopolitics and having this happen when it's happening is just a critical time in our life. And I really feel that the Biden administration has played a part. I'm not going to say a large part because I don't know that, but they definitely not a small part, but definitely a part in seeing this emboldened behavior from some of our historic enemies.
Well, when your enemies see you as weak,
right, and
disorganized, as with the withdrawal from Afghanistan,
yep.
I mean it was like signal go,
right? Yeah, I mean, I just it saddens me because obviously we've worked very hard to have the international order where it benefits everybody, and now we're going to see this new domain of warfare potentially up in space. And don't get me started on China and Russia wanting to go to the moon. I think that's going to be a huge problem. We're probably going to have to do a separate video on this, but just to kind of give you a preview, I mean, the islands that China is building in the South China Sea, the United States and the United Nations say, hey, look, this is not your territory. And they say, oh, we're just building these islands, to kind of be for navigation purposes. We're building these islands just for research purposes. We're not going to militarize these islands. And, the United States and the UN, other countries, let them do it. And then, surprise, surprise, they are armed to the teeth.
That's kind of like telling your toddler, don't get up on the table.
Yeah. I mean,
and then they climb up this tall chair right next to the table. Like, well, why else are they going to be there? Because they're going to get up on the table.
Yeah, and so I mean, so they militarize these islands, and they want to put research stations, manned research stations on the moon. Here, am I going to be the first person on the internet to make this prediction? If China is allowed to have a lunar base or a base on Mars,
what do you think they're going to do with it?
They're going to militarize that base. I'm the first one to say it. Great. That'll be awesome. That'll be a quote. If we allow them to have lunar bases and bases on Mars, they will militarize those bases, and those lunar bodies and planetary bodies will be a new source of conflict.
Yeah, a new launch pad too.
New launch pad as well. So yeah, so we saw this and we thought it was interesting, so we wanted to bring it to your attention. But thank you so much for tuning into Azimuth Podcast. Please stay tuned after these messages.
Hi everyone. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy our show with all the stories we share, we would love your support.
And it's as easy as clicking that subscribe or follow button. This will ensure you never miss an episode and keeps us bringing you these important stories. Your support makes a huge difference. Thank you so much for being part of our podcast family.
Thanks, and keep tuning in.